The first big lie you were told about money is that it's about luck. That wealth is a stroke of luck, a lightning bolt that strikes a select few, or an inheritance received only by those fortunate enough to be born into the right family. And if you believe that, you've already lost. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built. It's not an accident, it's not a lottery, it's not divine favor. It's the inevitable consequence of a mindset that operates with rules completely different from those used by most people. When you see the person driving the expensive car, closing the multi-million-dollar deal, going from nothing to building a life of opportunity, you think, how lucky. But I see something entirely different. I see someone who decoded the code of scarcity and replaced it with the architecture of abundance. And that, even if you don't believe it yet, you can do too. Now I want you to ask yourself a simple, yet brutal question: what if the real obstacle to your wealth isn't your current bank account, your boss, the government, or your country? What if what's holding you back is precisely the one thing you think you control? Your mindset. But listen, I'm not talking about the superficial mindset of motivational phrases that are forgotten in 10 minutes. I'm talking about a deep, uncomfortable, almost surgical internal restructuring. A transformation that takes your financial trauma, your history of scarcity, your bottled-up pain, and turns it into strategic fuel. A transformation that turns your fear into laser clarity. This isn't an inspirational talk. This is the mindset that takes someone born without advantages, without connections, without resources, and transforms them into someone who builds a 6-figure, 7-figure income and a completely different life. Let me tell you Alejandro's story, because if you understand his story, you'll understand your own from a completely different perspective. Alejandro grew up in a house without interior doors. Not by design, but out of necessity. In his neighborhood, nobody talked about investments, stocks, or financial freedom. They talked about whether the fridge would be full that day. His parents weren't lazy, they worked double shifts, in grueling, exhausting jobs, but the money always vanished before the month was out. Poverty wasn't an event, it was the ecosystem. And when you live in chronic scarcity, your brain becomes a deficit calculator. It forces you to think only in the very short term: can I afford this? Can I afford that? What band-aid can I use today to survive until tomorrow? It's a defensive, reactive system, designed only to survive, never to build. One day, Alejandro was sitting, watching a bricklayer build a wall at the house next door. The bricklayer placed brick after brick, each one exactly the same, with almost hypnotic precision. And Alejandro, still with that spark of curiosity that life hadn't extinguished, asked him, "Sir, how do you know where to put the next brick?" The bricklayer laughed, wiped the sweat from his brow, and replied with something that would change Alejandro's life forever: "Young man, I don't lay bricks. I build a cathedral in my mind, and I only fill in the gaps I see on the blueprint." That night, Alejandro understood something his parents had never grasped: they weren't poor because they lacked money. They were poor because they lacked a blueprint. They were spending all their energy on patching things up, putting out fires, surviving today, but never building the cathedral of tomorrow. That was the first mental brick. Because the journey from scarcity to abundance doesn't begin with a better job, a miraculous business, or luck. It begins with designing your mental cathedral. This is where I want you to pay attention, because what's coming up is the heart of this video. Wealthy people play a completely different game. I'm not talking about golf or secret societies. I'm talking about the unwritten rules that govern how they think about risk, time, pain, identity, and scale. And today I'm going to reveal those principles to you exactly as Alejandro applied them to go from a house without doors to owning the construction company that builds those houses. But before we get into the first principle, let me say something naturally and directly: if this message is already making you think differently, please consider subscribing to the channel. We talk about this every week: how to grow internally so your life can grow externally. Now then. Principle number 1. The inverse principle: pain as an asset, not a debt. The scarcity mindset sees pain as something to be avoided at all costs. Literally, his entire system is built around the goal of avoiding discomfort, avoiding the pain of being fired, avoiding the pain of having his idea rejected, avoiding the pain of an investment that didn't work out. For most people, the goal is comfort. But the risen millionaire knows a very uncomfortable truth: comfort is a death trap. When you're poor, pain is omnipresent. It's around every corner. Most people use it as an excuse: I can't because this happened to me. They believe the world owes them something for their suffering. That's called emotional debt. But the inverse principle says that your financial trauma is your greatest untapped asset. Steel is tempered with extreme heat to become stronger. And so are you. The poor person sees pain as an outstanding bill, the rich person sees it as a resilience lab. Every failure isn't a loss of money, it's the elimination of a variable that isn't working. Alejandro turned the coldness of his home into a tolerance for risk. He would say, I've already experienced absolute scarcity. What's the worst that can happen if my business fails? Feeling cold again. I know how to survive that. What I don't know is how to survive the regret of not trying. That's the real breaking point. The pain of discipline weighs grams, the pain of regret weighs tons. If anything I just said resonated with you, leave it in the comments. Seriously. I want to read it. Maybe your story can help someone going through the same thing. Let's move on to the second principle, the one that literally multiplied Alejandro's life. Principle number 2, the law of multiplication. Trade results, not hours. The scarcity mindset is obsessed with time. With the wrong question, how much am I paid per hour? That thought forever chains you to the salaried worker model. It turns you into someone who sells their most valuable resource, time, in exchange for a fixed amount. And if the day has 24 hours, your maximum wealth is limited by definition. The millionaire who rises from poverty doesn't think like that. He's obsessed not with time, but with impact. His question is different: how many lives can I touch, how many problems can I solve, how many people can I transform with a single unit of my effort? That leap, from linear to exponential thinking, is what separates the survivor from the cathedral builder. Money isn't an exchange of hours. It's a certificate of transferred value. You get paid not for what you do, but for the problem you solve and the scale at which you solve it. Alejandro quit his hourly job and started his construction business. At first, he could only build one wall. He was limited by his own hands. But he applied the law of multiplication. He systematized the process, created a blueprint, trained others, wrote a manual, and sold the system, not just the wall. Suddenly, he was no longer exchanging 8 hours for $100. He was investing 8 hours in creating a system that, operated by 10 other people, generated $1,000 while he slept. That's the game. Poor people work inside the system, rich people work on top of the system. If you keep exchanging your hours for money, you're not building a cathedral, you're renting a spot inside one. And now I want to ask you, without breaking the rhythm, what problem can you solve for 10 people simultaneously using skills you already possess? Leave a comment. Because verbalizing it is the first step to making it real. Let's move on to the third principle. Principle number 3, the identity paradox. Dismantle who you were to create who you will be. This is the most painful pillar, and that's why most people never cross it. When you grow up in scarcity, your identity merges with poverty. You become the person who struggles, the person who always barely makes ends meet, the person who can't afford things. Your habits, your social circle, your emotional reactions, everything is perfectly calibrated to keep you exactly where you are. Wealthy people understand that identity precedes income. You don't become rich to be a different person. You become a different person, and that attracts wealth. It's a cruel paradox: those who have the least are the ones who have to do the hardest inner work. Because they not only have to build new habits, they have to destroy their old identity. If you're disorganized in small ways, you'll be a financial disaster in large ways. If you're impulsive with $20, imagine what you'll be like with $200,000. Alejandro did something radical. He changed his environment. He stopped going to places where the main conversation was complaining. Not out of arrogance, but because his future identity couldn't survive in that ecosystem. He adopted an uncomfortable habit, reading about finance even if he didn't understand anything. He wasn't doing it to learn, he was doing it to get used to seeing himself as an entrepreneur. He rewrote his internal dialogue. He stopped saying, "I can't afford it," and replaced it with, "How can I afford it?" The first phrase is a declaration of defeat. The second is a plan of attack. If you want to continue receiving content to support you in this process, like this video. It's not for the algorithm, it's so I know this is helping you and can continue creating content that can assist you. Let's continue. Because the transformation doesn't end with the 3 principles. This is where it solidifies, in the internal narrative. Most people live trapped because they avoid pain instead of embracing it, because they trade time instead of multiplying impact, because they cling to an outdated identity. But listen carefully, your humble origins are not your downfall. They are your strategic advantage. They gave you a perspective on life, emotional resilience, and a tolerance for risk that people born into comfort will never have. But you don't have to hit rock bottom to activate this transformation. All you need to do is design your mental cathedral. Remember the bricklayer. If you only focus on the cement, you'll build patches. If you focus on the cathedral, filling in the gaps is just part of the process. Your poverty may have been your starting point, but only your mindset has the power to keep you there. Your wealth isn't what you have. It's who you're becoming. So the only question that matters now is this. Which brick will you lay today, to match the cathedral you've designed in your mind?